to Grimm's Gates of Horror. I'm Grim, and this is the New Haven for all things horror. And today, I'm going to be reviewing the horror comedy mockumentary called Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. The Rise of Leslie Vernon is an incredible mockumentary horror comedy that follows a normal-looking guy, Leslie Vernon, who has an obsession with movie-style slashers like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger, and decides to follow in their footsteps, and invites a documentary filmmaker and her crew to follow him around as he constructs his own grisly legacy. Nathan Baesel as Leslie Vernon truly captures how I feel a serial killer would be like when preparing to kill someone. I can truly see Norman Bates in his appearance, and his personality is like that of like Billy and Stu from Scream, like the two of them in one person. And the performance from Baesel in this movie was just perfect. Angela Goethals in this movie is also amazing, as she is a documentary host where she's kind of like her own combination of like Gail Weathers and Sidney Prescott from like the Scream franchise. And in this review, I'm going to be comparing this a lot to Scream because this came out in 2006, so it was like right after. It's like between Scream 3 and Scream 4, so it's kind of like it kind of has a lot of similarities and some things that they did different that I will like touch upon. Yeah, Angela Goethals in this movie is also amazing and is the person following Leslie around for the whole movie. I feel like this movie is just so underrated in the slasher fandom after watching this movie. I mean, the humor in this movie is sort of what you expect as it's satire and is similar to Scream, but a bit more comedic and goofy, which I felt like the balance of this movie was perfect. Where this feels more like more like a parody and like satire-ish, while Scream is more like a social commentary and commenting on the current meta of horror. Those are like the two differences between like genre and the tones. Where Scream has more of a serious approach to its story. And I feel like in this movie the balance is just perfect, especially when it came to the raunchy horror slasher tropes that we hear in this movie. Like, there's so many little context that goes into how a serial killer, or let's say like a slasher or a movie slasher, like the lengths that they go to, the in depth and context and little things that they do to make their plans succeed as much as they can. It was so interesting following Leslie through the documentary and seeing how he prepared to kill, his brain process, just how committed he was to this lifelong dream of his. The satire tropes in this movie, like switching from the documentary camera style to the generic horror slasher style, I think was pretty great. And also the twist towards the end, I find genius and well thought out, as it had been built up since the beginning, and the fake out truly threw me off. I honestly didn't find anything in this movie that really bothered me at all, or anything like that, because this movie was just a lot of fun, charming, it has some gore galore, and just executes its premise and tone so perfectly. And so, with that being said, I'm going to start getting to the spoilers and going deep into what I think about this movie. So, if you haven't seen Behind the Mask, Rise of Leslie Vernon yet, I recommend to go watch it and come back to this video because full spoilers are starting right now. So this is the story of an eager, up-and-coming serial killer named Leslie Vernon. Leslie lives in the small suburban town of Glen Echo, and his life's goal is to become a master in the art of fear, just like his more infamous contemporaries, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and Michael Myers. To document his meteoric rise to power, Leslie has enlisted the aid of grad student documentarian Taylor Gentry and her two cameramen, Doug and Todd. So this movie starts out with shots of Elm Street, shots of Haddonfield, shots of Crystal Lake, I believe, and it just really gets you to the vibe of that documentary feel that this movie has. Taylor has a one-on-one interview with Vernon, who details the tricks of the trade. Like, he gives a tour of his house, and that's when Taylor points out these books that he has, that he studies, and he reads upon like the different tricks. Some books are like sleight of hand, some about magic tricks that would help him be better at throwing his victims off. He also illustrates the numerous pitfalls that come with his chosen profession, as well as the rules and code of ethics that every serial killer worth his salt must abide by. And this is when Leslie Vernon explains how he can't really explain why he does what he does, why, just like how Chucky, Jason, Michael, they can't explain why they do what they do, but the point of this documentary is to show how he does it, not why he does it. He talks about how it's more deeper and that she just does not get it yet. It's all about her own understanding of why like someone like her would do it, or why she think he'd do it, basically. And it really does put into perspective why Billy Loomis kind of said like he doesn't believe in motive, because like there could be many factors, or it just depends on the person with a different perspective on why they do it. So after Taylor asks how they do it, Leslie takes Taylor and her crew to his childhood home, an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere in an apple orchard farm. Basically, he shows them around the house. He illustrates how he's basically dead. Like no one knows he's alive. He's basically a legend, an urban legend, basically, in this town of Glen Echo. And basically every year a group of teenagers come to the house on the anniversary to party, to smoke, to hook up, basically, as like a tradition. And then he details how the grass at certain times, certain climates, gets really hard to walk in, and like it gets like muddy, and that right there is like a detail that he uses later, which just blew my mind when I noticed that. I'm like, wow. Like the little thoughts and details that I put into this movie and into the story are just amazing. And then after this, we cut to a scene of him practicing his cardio, getting his punches in, basically explaining why cardio is so important for a slasher. Basically saying how you have to be able to run to catch up to your victim. And then he details how there's that whole thing of looking like you're walking while your victims are running, basically kind of like Michael Myers in a sense. I got a good laugh out of that. In this documentary form, we scope out a high school, basically where Leslie points out the different cliques and different social groups, where you have the jocks, you have the nerds, you have like the outcasts, and then you just have that one group where it's like a mix of them all. You have the jock, you have the nerd, you have the cheerleader, and basically girl in the middle who doesn't fit into any of those categories. She's basically your survival girl. But Leslie goes on to explain how he's already picked his victim, and if he just now started picking his victim, they'd be way behind schedule, basically. You have to stalk this person, you have to watch them for a long time, know their schedule, know where they go, like what they do, what their social life is like. Basically, you have to like get the whole life down and memorize it to do this like successfully. And I just love how deep this movie goes into the perspective of the killer. Like with Scream, you don't really get that. You just get the perspective of what's like as a survivor and trying to figure this out mentally, and I think that's what I love about Scream. But this movie takes it to another perspective of like the killer, and I've always wondered what that was like, and that kind of like makes me think why this movie is so underrated, because I think many people like me have wondered what goes into a slasher becoming who they are, how they prep to execute these kills in their plan that they work so hard on. So then we cut to meeting his primary target, the survival girl, Kelly Curtis. Kelly is a young, blonde-haired, virgin woman who works at a diner. And his intent for Kelly is to be the one member of her group to survive Leslie's carefully prepared massacre, and quite possibly be the one who will ultimately defeat him. Leslie then convinces Taylor to assist him in a flyby scare outside the diner where Kelly works. So this is basically when Laurie sees Michael Myers outside the window of the school, and it's basically the first scare that we hint at, that we get, where you get that built up suspense. And as this flyby is happening, this first scare, they cut to the horror slasher style like camera work and the music, and it's just shot really well, and it's just like, oh my, like you just laugh because of how they're really playing to these tropes and really making it feel like a slasher, like a hybrid between a slasher and a documentary. After this, Leslie brings the crew to the home of his mentor, and a retired serial killer by the name of Eugene, played by Scott Wilson, R.I.P. But we meet his mentor Eugene and his wife Jamie. He adds some insight into the evolution of the industry and comments how today's serial killers have a much tougher go at it than the older generations. Like Eugene, he said he was a killer in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was a lot easier for someone to being a serial killer. And then he talks about how people like Chucky, Freddy, Jason, Michael, they're like the top of the top, and how like these rules don't really apply to them just because they're just that high on the scale. And it's weird because when we first meet Eugene, he's saying in this like self-deprivation chamber tube, it like helps you loosen your body, make it easier to like move, make it easier for you to breathe lightly. And I thought that was interesting in itself. It kind of explains like their way of explaining how Michael Myers can get old but still do the things that he does. How Jason, like, I mean, he got freaking resurrected and Jason lives, and he was able to do all of that still. So little things like that I just find interesting. But later, Leslie details his red herring strategy, which involves killing someone who only has marginal contact with prime target. This could be like a side character, someone who's in the survival girls routine that they see on a daily or weekly basis, but they're not really that important to them. And for this, Leslie chooses Mrs. Collingwood, who is the old librarian from the Glen Echo Library where Kelly goes to a lot. And Leslie manipulates her into asking for Mrs. Collingwood's assistance on researching a 30-year-old newspaper article. And during all of this, Taylor and her film crew, they capture the whole encounter, like changing from the documentary perspective into the slasher perspective, going back and forth between it. I thought that was really interesting. So Leslie dons his torn up overalls and green mask, and Leslie gets ready to slaughter Miss Collingwood right before Kelly's eyes. And that's when a well-dressed elderly man bursts into the library shouting Leslie's name and waving a gun, screaming, "No more, it ends here." He fires off a few shots and Leslie takes one to the shoulder and the librarian faints and Kelly runs off screaming. But Leslie and Taylor's crew manage to escape the library without further incident. Before we talk about this, let's go to this well-dressed elderly man, because he's not just any well-dressed elderly man. It is Robert Englund himself, Freddy Krueger, the actor who played Freddy Krueger, Robert Englund. And in this movie, he's playing like this parody of Donald Pleasance's Samuel Loomis, and I thought that was so fucking funny. Like, instead of playing like a bad like killer type person, no, he's playing like who Leslie says is his psychiatrist. Later on, Leslie then explains to Taylor that the old man was Doc Halloran, his former therapist. Leslie is in fact overjoyed at the sudden turn of events and cites that Halloran is his Ahab, and an Ahab is a representation of all that is good in the world, and one who serves as a primary counterbalance to all of Leslie's effort. And so, talking in Halloween, it's Dr. Loomis. In Scream, I think is technically Gail Weathers, since she knows like the truth about Billy or like about Cotton. If you watch Scream, you know what I'm talking about. But that's basically what Doc Halloran is, Robert Englund is to Leslie Vernon. And so this is the person that kind of threatens the serial killer or the slasher, and kind of like makes the horror more intense. And you're kind of like, oh, maybe there's a shot at defeating this guy after all. Taylor, however, is not as elated by the experience as Leslie is. Taking some time alone with her crew, she begins to suspect that Leslie is not playing a trick on her with all of his psycho killer talk and may actually prove to be a threat to Kelly. So Taylor and her crew go to the diner to warn her, but that's when Doc Halloran spots them after watching over Kelly, and Halloran tells Taylor that Leslie lied to her about his background. He's not actually Leslie Vernon, but someone named Leslie Mancuso from Reno. And Halloran tries to warn her to stay away from Leslie, but Taylor and her crew leave the diner in a hurry. And as they're leaving the diner, Leslie is already waiting outside the diner and discovers that Taylor intended on warning Kelly. And he gets a little rough with her, like pushes her up against the van light. And Taylor files back, accusing him of lying to her. And Leslie finally admits that he was dishonest about his identity. This is like at the point where you kind of like feel the threat that Leslie is. Like during this whole thing, you're kind of like, oh yeah, this is so cool, getting to see the insight of the behind the scenes of what makes a killer, how they set up and how they do what they do. But no, this is like the turning point where you're like, oh shit, like, this dude is actually serious. He's actually real about this. And then basically he says he chose the Vernon family name in order to immerse himself into the town's local lore. So he took on the urban legend, made it about him so that he could have he could live by the legend and be as big as like Michael or Jason or Freddy in that instance. And so at this point, Leslie gives Taylor and her crew an ultimatum whether they can leave, they don't have to be a part of this, or they can stay and they can continue documenting how Leslie pairs and does what he does, which is kill this group of teenagers. And they decide to do it and go through with it. Since they're already here, they already halfway through it. Why not just see it through, see how it happens? And after much planning, Leslie details his ultimate plot. Like I said earlier, the regional legend of this town is that the long-abandoned Vernon farmhouse is haunted by the spirit of the late Molly Vernon. It has become a tradition for young students to see who is brave enough to spend an entire evening inside the house. Aware of when this event is taking place, Leslie surveys the house at length, making sure that his strategy for slaughtering Kelly and her friends will not yield any dangerous surprises for him. He shows Taylor how he has bolted all the windows. Taylor actually asks him why, but don't they just smash the windows anyway? He's like, Surprisingly, they don't. And when they do, it's on the second floor anyway. I got a kick out of that joke because that's literally the trope that happens in like I think it's happened in Scream. It happened in Halloween. Like it's happened in a lot of horror movies. And I found that really funny. And replace fresh flashlight batteries with dead ones and sabotage any possible weapon that might be used against. Like basically cracking like an axe's like handle, like separating a sledgehammer's like head from its handle, and like basically just sabotaging any weapon so that in the first hit, the weapon will be broken. Basically, one thing that I thought was interesting is that he rerouted the power box basically so that he controls all the lights with one little like switch of like a gadget. I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And he also even pre-cut window side tree limbs, so like tree branches that are like by any windows, he cut them like halfway so that if any of his would-be victims tried to evacuate from a second story window, they would fall to their death. And then he showing his plan because up to this point, Kelly and like the teenagers have basically gone through like what he predicted would happen in the different scenes of the horror slasher like style. Basically, with what happened in the library, what happened when he did the first scare, like all of it was like lining up, and like he was able to predict what would happen. He then explains how he intends his final showdown with Kelly to take place in a building which the Vernons used to crush apples from the orchard inside of an old metal grinder. And so that evening, Taylor, Doug, Todd accompany Leslie Vernon to the farmhouse while the party is taking place. Taylor still thinks that Leslie isn't serious about committing these murders, and she's basically in denial about it. But then she soon discovers how wrong she is, as Leslie murders two of the revelers with his sickle, basically killing the first two teenagers as they go upstairs to hook up. And that's when Taylor's like, oh shit, this is actually happening, oh my god, and has this look on her face like they can't sit by and let this happen, basically. And that's basically what Leslie says. He's like, okay, get out, come on. And it was basically, you had that look on your face. And they're like, what look? Look where like, we can't just sit here and let this happen. We have to help. We have to help these teenagers. And so he like kicks him out of the house, makes him go back to the van and says his goodbyes. As he says, by the end of this, they're not going to even be seeing each other. He's either going to be dead, locked up, or hiding away somewhere. And that's exactly what Taylor does. And so all three, Doug, Todd, and Taylor, they all go back into the house. And this time, and at this point, the documentary style is over with. Like, there's no more of that style. It's now turned into a horror slasher style for the rest of the final act. And they go in, they try to warn Kelly about what's taking place, and Leslie is elsewhere in the house, and the rest of the guests have yet to realize that they are being stalked. I believe this time Leslie is in the basement, killing off the boyfriend of the cheerleader, so that she can run upstairs and inform everyone the dude is dead, basically. I think his name was Pete or something. And that's when Taylor bursts into a room where she finds Kelly, the virgin survival girl, having wild hanky-panky with her boyfriend. It is clear to all of them that Kelly is not nearly as innocent as Taylor had been led to believe. And meanwhile, Vernon kills the two Sterner kids who wander out to the tool shed, as he only suspected one to wander out there, but there were two. So he kills the first Sterner by slicing his head into with his sickle, and then he killed the second one by extracting his heart with a fence post sticker. And I'm just like, oh my god, like, I thought that was pretty cool and that was pretty funny. Like, I kind of got a good kick out of that. Like, he basically just took the dude's heart out of his chest and like placed it in his hand. I was like, oh my god, it's so cheesy, but it's also so good because it reminds me of those good like Friday the 13th kills, those executions. It was just amazing. Back inside the main house, the others begin to realize what is going on and that their lives are in danger. Taylor then comes to the realization that she was always intended to be Leslie's survival girl, and this whole time Leslie has set this up. And he was the one to invite Taylor to like film this and everything. And now Taylor realized that she was the final girl this entire time. She was the survival girl and not Kelly. Kelly was basically the fake out. Vernon had worked Taylor, Doug, and Todd into their plot as well, as they tried to like backtrack like what his plan was and try to mess up his plan to catch Vernon off guard. But no, this was his plan the entire time. So he already predicted what was going to happen, what moves they were going to do. He like thought this out entirely. And just when you think about that mentally and you think about how much depth and how detailed like not only the writers of this movie went into things this, but then thinking about the mind of like someone like this, how demented and how devoted and invested they are into this perfection, I guess you would say. It's just like, oh my god. Like it's really like a 5-head, like, I'm sorry for speaking like this, but it's really a 5-head. It's really complex and really oriented. And then Kelly tries to escape by smashing out an upstairs window. And Taylor tries to warn her about the pre-cut tree branches, but she's too late and Kelly falls to her death. And this was actually funny because the two girls get into it, the cheerleader and then Kelly. They're like, what? And because Kelly's like, wait, why would he be after me? And Taylor's like, you're the virgin final girl. The cheerleader laughed. As right before she tries to go out the window, Kelly screams, I'm sorry that I'm not a virgin. And just falls to her death. And it's just so funny and so hilarious, like watching it play out and just like, oh my god. It's just so chaotic and so it's like you're also really invested in this and you want to see how this plays out. And that's why I'm like, this movie is so underrated and it's such a great like horror comedy slasher in its own way. Kind of like Scream, but in like a different sense and a different perspective. And so after Kelly falls to her death, the crew race outside to escape Leslie Vernon, and Doug decides to run off on his own to try to distract Leslie. But he then baits Leslie to follow him, and thus enabling the others time to escape. But Leslie catches up to him, and this is where like the muddy like grass, like where your feet can get stuck easily and you can trip because of that. That's when this comes into play, and he said that earlier, and so I was like, oh my god, that little detail right there. Leslie catches up to him, and as Doug tries to reason with Leslie and be like, come on man, it's me, it's Doug, Leslie then breaks his neck. I'm just like, god dang, like, this dude is actually really into this. He's actually like killing these people. It's just like, god, like, just a minute ago we were like hearing his stories, we were like really getting invested into this person, but now it's just like there's no turning back. He's a killer now. Like, there's no reasoning with him. And by this point, Doc Halloran arrives at the scene and faces Leslie Vernon inside the barn. Leslie draws him close and stabs him in the shoulder with his sickle. And then Todd tries to stop Leslie, but Vernon violently pushes him into a support beam, knocking him down. And it comes to the point where the only ones left are Taylor and Vernon, as Vernon had predicted. And Taylor evolves into the survival girl archetype and openly challenges Leslie to stop her, basically grabbing one of the weapons, basically, and having like the iconic like white tank top that you see survival girls having. And the two face off each other in the apple orchard barn. And Taylor succeeds in killing Leslie by crushing his head with an apple grinder. And afterward, she douses the barn with gasoline and lights it up on fire. Taylor then runs outside and is happy to discover that Todd and Doc Halloran are still alive. And as they watch the flames consume the barn, Todd openly asks, what was he? To which Halloran responds, just a man. He was just a man. And right there, I kind of rolled my eyes at that line because I'm just like, that's exactly what like they said Halloween ends. And it's like in this, it works. When Halloween ends, it's like, no, Michael Myers is not a man. He's the boogeyman. He's the shape. He's not just a man. And I just hate how they try to portray him as that in Halloween Ends. But in this instance, it actually works because he's just a man. That's all he is. But yeah, that's the review of The Rise of Leslie Vernon, Behind the Mask. And yeah, I really enjoy this movie. And with all this being said, I give Behind the Mask an A++, which is like the top of the tier. It's above A+. And it's rare for movies like that to be that high for me. But after watching this movie, it's right up. It's like right at the top for me. Yeah, I hope you all did enjoy this review. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe if you are new, and if you find yourself coming back to my videos on the regular, turn post notifications on to get notified when I do post next. I plan to post more on this channel. And let me know what you thought about this movie down below. Did you like it? Did you not like it? I'd really like to hear your thoughts on it. And all my socials are down in the description below. I have my Snapchat, my Instagram. I have my Twitter on there as well. That's where I'm mostly active on. So if you'd like to follow me there, I would really appreciate it. And you'll also get notified on there when I do post as well as on my Snapchat. Those are like the two where I post when a new video goes live. So leave some feedback down in the comments. Let me know what I can work on, what movies you'd like to see me review. I plan to do a bunch of horror movies. I have a whole catalog of horror movies that I plan to review and talk about and to put on your radar. Yeah, so just let me know what I can improve on, what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. I really appreciate the feedback that I've gotten so far from the comments. Hope y'all did enjoy. So if you have AMC Plus or you're looking to rent this movie on Prime, I recommend checking out Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon right now.